I mentioned earlier that this is my last Yom Kippur here at Beth Am, which brings up lots and lots of memories. And one of the memories it brings up when I think about, this is my 16th cycle, it's been over 15 years. And I remember when I was interviewing at Beth Am and I was reading the description of the synagogue, and it sounded like an extraordinary place, but there were a couple of quirky things. And one of the quirky things is they said the thing they were known for was martyrology. And I thought, that's weird. I mean, martyrology is that thing you do kind of toward the end of the morning-ish services on Yom Kippur when everybody's kind of exhausted and half of the people have already left, and we kind of mumble through these really, important but painful episodes in Jewish history with the martyr of the 10 martyrs at Caesarea after the Bar Kokhba revolt, and we talk about some of the other rotten things that have happened to our people, but mostly people are kind of, done and exhausted and hungry and all that kind of stuff. And then I came to Beth Am and I experienced my first Rheda Becker Martyrology presentation. Over the course of 40 years, Rheda Becker has been really engrossing us with her well-researched and extremely well-presented material. She's spoken over the years, just to name a few, about Anne Frank, about Raoul Wallenberg, about the blood libel and the protocols of the elders of Zion, about Sugihara, about the Soviet Union and its relationship with the final solution and Baba Yar. She spoke about Janusz Korczak and the Dreyfus affair. And just last year, she spoke about Bambi. And I learned so much to that tale about which I had no idea. Today, Rheda Becker is going to give her 40th presentation, and it will be about Leo Frank. I wish I could say that these stories from our past had no relevance today. Unfortunately, as we sit and listen to them, I know that they do. I know that our attention to Rheda means that they do. But Rheda is a student of history. She's not here to tell us what it means in this moment. She's here to tell us what happens. And that has been an incredible, incredible gift all of these 40 years. Rheda, I'd like to call you now to the Bima and offer us this year's Martyrology presentation. As you know, following the presentation, there will be an additional program where Tom Hall will join Rheda and we'll hear a conversation about these past 4 decades.
Rabbi Berg, thank you. Thank you so much. You have been the most wonderful colleague and inspiration. And I thank you for that beautiful introduction and much more. Thank you. Can we hear? No. Nope? Okay. Let's make it better. How about this? Is this good? Good. On Yom Kippur, in synagogues throughout the world, we remember Jewish martyrs, people who were murdered for no other reason than they were Jews. In the past 40 years here at Beth Am, I've had the privilege of leading this service in which we recall martyrs of different periods of Jewish history. This has become our tradition to spend this time together with our welcomed guests to bear witness to these terrible injustices. Today, we will hear about an event that took place right here in the United States at the beginning of the 20th century. It's the story of the horrific lynching of Leo Frank, a Texas-born, middle-class, young Jewish businessman in Atlanta, who was wrongly accused of the murder of one of his employees, a 13-year-old girl named Mary Fagan. Leo Frank's fate was an injustice rooted in Jew hatred that's evident throughout the tragic story. In 1910, there were 4,000 Jews in Atlanta in a population of 155,000. Atlanta had more Jews than any other city in the South. The Reformed rabbi of the city, David Marks, was very popular with the city's Gentiles. He established better relations with the Christian clergy than he did with the Orthodox rabbis of the immigrants from Eastern Europe. Marx and his congregation were concerned about these newly arriving Jews who dressed differently and spoke Yiddish. They feared that these new Jews would awaken anti-Semitism where it had been notably absent. The Jewish community of Atlanta had entered into the social and political establishment of the city. A number of Jewish-Gentile law partnerships were formed in Atlanta. Jews had been elected to the Atlanta City Council and to the Georgia House of Representatives. Jews were active in the Elks, the Shriners, and the Masons, and although there were a few social clubs that were closed to Jews, the Jews mixed widely and easily in Atlanta society. But things began to change. Those Jews who had lived in Atlanta a long time began to worry that the widespread esteem that they had enjoyed was beginning to fade. Several Jewish candidates for the city council failed to be elected. There were complaints about the Russian Jewish saloon keepers and the Russian Jewish pawnbrokers. Leo Frank was a newcomer to Atlanta. Although he was born in Texas of German Jewish parents, he grew up in Brooklyn, New York. He graduated Cornell with a degree in mechanical engineering. In 1908, when he was 24, Frank moved to Atlanta to become the superintendent for the National Pencil Company, of which his uncle was the major stockholder. In 1911, he married Lucille Selle, daughter of a wealthy manufacturer in Atlanta. Frank's background helped him earn immediate acceptance, and soon he was elected president of B'nai B'rith. Saturday, April 26, 1913. This was Confederate Memorial Day, an important holiday in the early 20th century South. It wasn't a day to be working for Mary Fagan. She was 13 years old and an employee of the National Pencil Company. Mary was not the only child of that age. Child labor was widely accepted in that era. Mary came to the factory shortly after noon to pick up her payroll envelope, which contained $1.20 wages due to her. Again, this was a different era. The envelope was handed to her by Leo Frank in his office. Mary entered the building at approximately 12:15 and headed for the staircase leading to the second floor. Unbeknownst to her, the company janitor, Jim Conley, a short, light-complexioned black man, was sitting on a box under the stairwell. Conley had been drinking beer, wine, and whiskey for several hours. Jim Conley and Leo Frank were the last two persons known to have seen Mary Fagan alive. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, Mary Fagan's body was discovered in the basement of the National Pencil Company by the night watchman, a black man named Newt Lee, who immediately telephoned the police. They found Mary face down on the earthen floor basement, which was littered with trash, coal dust, and pencil shavings. She'd been strangled. The police found 2 murder notes near her body, handwritten in pencil on a blank order sheet, riddled with misspellings, monosyllabic words, and grammatical oddities. The notes purport to have been written by Mary as she was being assaulted. An absolutely unbelievable idea. And the notes put blame on a long, tall Negro black. The night watchman, Newt Lee, who was tall, slim, and dark-complexioned, was arrested on the spot. The next day, The first newspaper articles about Mary Fagan's murder are published in 3 Atlanta dailies. All 3 newspapers competed with each other with shocking headlines, lurid stories, and false rumors. The day Lee was arrested, the Georgian printed a headline that exclaimed, "Lee's guilt proved." Now, this headline was so inciting that the mayor and police chief, fearing a lynching, put out a joint statement decrying the newspaper's sensational and misleading reports. The police found that even after roughing him up, they could not extract a confession from Newt Lee. And the evidence against him was really weak. It was bizarre notes. But the pressures built up for the police to find the murderer. In fact, the mayor openly threatened them. Find this murderer fast or be fired. 2 days after the arrest of Newt Lee, at 11:30 in the morning, 2 Atlanta police detectives arrest Leo Frank in his office for the murder of Mary Fagan. Frank would never have another day of freedom in his life. And as he is led into the police station, he tells reporters, "I am not guilty. Such an atrocious crime has never entered my mind." Above an unflattering photograph of Leo Frank, emphasizing his protruding eyes and thick glasses, the Georgian's headline flatly states, "Police have the strangler." Very soon, popular opinion turned against him. Many of Atlanta's citizens were willing to jump to conclusions about Leo Frank. He was rapidly transformed by the irresponsible press, from a respected businessman and community leader into a loathsome murderer, a monster. A month after her husband's arrest, Lucille Frank releases a statement accusing the prosecutor, a man named Hugh Dorsey, of pressuring witnesses to give false statements incriminating her husband. Dorsey had arrested and imprisoned the family's cook because she would not make a false statement about Leo Frank. Shortly after Leo Frank's arrest, the police arrest Jim Conley, who was found at the pencil factory washing red stains out of a blue workshop. After being subjected to interrogation tactics for a week, Jim Conley admits to police that he wrote the murder notes. But Conley claimed that Leo Frank summoned him to his office and told Conley to write down the notes which Frank dictated to him. On July 28, 1913, Leo Frank's jury trial begins in the Superior Court of Fulton County. It would be longer than any previous criminal trial in Georgia's history. Seated near Frank during the trial are his wife, Lucille, 25 years old, and his elderly mother, Rachel Frank. The cramped courtroom in which the trial takes place is oppressively hot, with a thermometer in the 90s. Throughout Leo Frank's trial, the judge struggles to maintain order and to suppress outbursts among the unruly spectators who packed the courtroom. They cheer and applaud the prosecutor, Hugh Dorsey, whereas they laugh and jeer at arguments and motions made by Leo Frank's defense counsel. And because of the blistering heat, the windows are kept open. And just outside the windows, large crowds, hostile to Frank, were expressing their angry feelings. All of this can be clearly heard inside the courtroom by the judge and, more importantly, the jury. And when Hugh Dorsey scores a point, the courtroom spectators and the crowds outside applaud at the same time. From the very beginning, Hugh Dorsey and his assistant prosecutors have displayed a disturbing inclination to see Frank convicted at all costs and by any means. They repeatedly arrange for the police to arrest persons like the Frank family's cook, who have made statements helpful to Frank. And these people were not released from jail until they retracted their previous declarations. In his extraordinary book about this case, the very best, titled "And the Dead Shall Rise," author Steve Oney writes that Hugh Dorsey displayed great cunning in suffering and adhering to the principle that the end justifies the means. He elicited false testimony against Frank by intimidating and bribing various witnesses. He blatantly appealed to juror prejudices against Northerners, Jews, factory owners, and capitalists. He urged witnesses to even lie under oath to build a case against Leo Frank. Harry Golden, in his book, Little Girl is Dead, describes Hugh Dorsey as a ruthlessly ambitious man who knew perfectly well that Frank was not guilty. Golden writes that Dorsey persisted in his prosecution of this innocent man because he realized that the case represented the chance of a lifetime. If he could convict Leo Frank, there was probably no office in the state of Georgia to which he could not succeed, since he would become a popular hero in bringing this rich northern Jew to justice. Dorsey did run for governor of the state in 1916. That was the year that Frank was lynched, and of course he won by an overwhelming majority. Unfortunately, Leo Frank's lawyers, although they were highly experienced practitioners, made blunder after blunder. For example, despite the overwhelming community hostility to their client, they never moved for a change of venue. And after the trial, they failed to raise claims of violations of Frank's constitutional rights to a fair trial. As a result, 13 attempts for a new trial failed due to the procedural defaults of his attorneys. The defense of Leo Frank was one of the most ill-conducted in the history of Georgia jurisprudence. On the seventh day of the trial, Jim Conley, the chief... Okay, good.
Just hoping this will help with the feedback a little bit.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, there's feedback. You have to hear it twice?
No, we heard you. Just see if that helps.
Thank you so much. On the seventh day of the trial, Jim Conley, the chief prosecution witness, takes the stand. He had been well rehearsed by Hugh Dorsey. Conley testifies that Leo Frank regularly used his office at the pencil factory for his perverse encounters with women, and that he employed Conley as a lookout. Conley said that he was providing that service on the day that Mary Fagan went up to Frank's office. He said that after a while, Frank called him upstairs and he said that Mary refused his advances and he hit her and that she struck her head when she fell. Conley said that he and Frank took the body to the elevator and they took it to the basement. Conley further states that when they returned to Frank's office, he quickly wrote the murder notes dictated to him by Frank. Conley ends, and Mr. Frank turned around in his chair and he looked at me and folded his hands and said, "Why should I hang? I have wealthy people in Brooklyn." Frank's lawyers grilled Conley for 16 hours over the next few days without breaking his well-rehearsed story. Following the prosecution, the defense states its case, claiming that it was Jim Conley who attacked Mary Fagan after she left Frank's office, that Conley threw her body down the trap door under the stairs into the basement and then wrote the murder notes, written purportedly by Mary while she was being assaulted. He blamed the crime on a long, tall Negro black, which was his attempt to cast blame for the murder on Newt Lee. Frank's lawyers argue that it isn't plausible that the college-educated engineer Leo Frank would have conjured up the bizarre notion of creating notes supposedly written by the victim as she was being assaulted. Also, a police detective testified that he had dictated 8 words to Conley, and that it took Conley 6 minutes to write 8 words. So how could Conley have written the murder notes, which contained 128 words, in the brief time he said he stayed in Frank's office? On the 19th day of the trial, Leo Frank makes a statement to the jury detailing his knowledge of events on that day. And he vehemently denied that he had anything to do with it. Gentlemen, I know nothing whatever of the death of little Mary Fagan. I never even saw Conley in the factory or anywhere else on that day. His statement is a tissue of lies from first to last. His statement as to coming up to help me dispose of the body is a monstrous lie. The story as to women coming into the factory for immoral purposes is a base lie. I have no rich relatives in Brooklyn. My father's an invalid. I've told you the truth, the whole truth. When Hugh Dorsey completes his fiery closing arguments, the judge, fearing that a verdict of acquittal could cause a riot, decides to adjourn until the following Monday. Leo Frank and his lawyers were requested not to be present, as the judge feared violence in the court in the event of a hung jury or an acquittal. That Monday, after deliberating for only 1 hour and 45 minutes, the jury returns with a verdict of guilty. As Dorsey leaves the building after the verdict, he is greeted by a huge cheering crowd of 5,000. The rejoicing in Atlanta is described as a Roman holiday. In a closed and hurried court session, the judge sentences Frank to death by hanging. Frank's lawyers file a motion for a new trial, which will have to be amended because of errors. They issue a public statement saying it was impossible for a jury to escape the effects of a jeering mob that invaded the courtroom. 2 months later, the judge denied the amended motion for a new trial because of procedural errors. However, he states in open court, and for the record, I have thought about this case more than any other I have ever tried. I am not certain of this man's guilt. On February 17, 1914, the Georgia Supreme Court affirms Leo Frank's murder conviction and death sentence by a 4-2 vote. The 2 dissenting judges maintain that Jim Conley's testimony concerning Frank's supposed lascivious behavior with women was calculated to prejudice the minds of the jurors and thereby deprive Frank of a fair trial. And this had some effect. The Atlanta Journal publishes a searing editorial, "Leo Frank should have a new trial." Leo Frank has not had a fair trial, and his death would constitute a kind of murder by judiciary. The Atlanta Journal publishes a searing editorial, "Leo Frank should have a new trial." These other Georgia newspapers favor a new trial as well. But there is a strong dissenting editorial that came from Tom Watson, who published a weekly newspaper called The Jeffersonian. He was a journalist, a lawyer, and a politician. He had been a progressive political figure and staunch defender of the rights of the poor, but he had drastically changed. He changed into an anti-Semitic, anti-Catholic, and racist leader. Over the next 18 months, Tom Watson will publish hundreds of pages vilifying Frank and his supporters. He played upon the prejudices and fears of his readers, referring to Frank as that foul, degenerate New York Jew and that rich, depraved sodomite Jew. Watson made it clear that individuals or newspapers who dared to publicly express a belief in Frank's innocence would be accused of having been bought with Jewish money. The emergence of Tom Watson on the scene was the most disastrous turn of events for Leo Frank. April 24th, 1914, a hearing on a new trial motion. The defense lawyers introduced an affidavit of Jim Conley's girlfriend, Annie Maud Carter. She said that Conley had confessed to her that he had murdered Mary Fagan. He said that on that day of the murder, he was sitting on a box at the foot of the staircase when Mary came in. And when she came down, he told her that someone had called her. When she turned her back, he struck her with his fist, knocking her down, and he pushed her through a trapdoor into the basement, so people would later think that the building's night watchman had done it. He found paper and pencil there, and he wrote the murder notes and laid them by her side. He kept the money he found in Mary Fagan's purse. Annie Maud Carter also displayed a batch of letters that Conley had written to her. The letters are remarkably similar to the murder notes. October 1914, William Smith. Now, this man was Jim Conley's lawyer, and he stated publicly that his own investigations convinced him that Conley, his client, was the killer and Leo Frank was innocent. He described Conley's testimony as a fabrication. Now, as a result of this and other statements in favor of Leo Frank, William Smith received death threats. He saw his law practice ruined, and he was forced to leave Atlanta with his family for their own safety. November 1914, Judge Rowan, who had presided over Frank's trial, was dying of cancer and dictated a letter to Governor Slayton recommending that Frank's sentence be commuted to life imprisonment, not even for freedom, but for life. After many months of continued deliberation, I am uncertain of Leo Frank's guilt. April 12, 1915. The United States Supreme Court, by a 7-2 vote, affirms the federal court's dismissal of Frank's petition. The two dissenting justices are Oliver Wendell Holmes and Charles Evan Hughes, who wrote, "Due process," and this will resonate with you, "due process embraces the fundamental conception of a fair trial with an opportunity to be heard. Mob law does not become due process of law by securing the assent of a terrorized jury." For the fourth time, a trial court fixes a new date for Leo Frank's execution. Frank addresses the trial judge. "My execution will not avenge Mary Fagan's death. A life will have been taken for a life, but the real culprit will not have paid the penalty. My trust is in God, who knows that my protestations of innocence are the truth. At some future date, the whole mortal world will realize it." Throughout the US, large numbers of Americans, not even, or primarily Jews, responded as if a horrible miscarriage of justice had taken place, unthinkable in the United States, or perhaps possibly only in the bigoted South. Over 100,000 letters were received by the governor of Georgia and the prison commission urging that Frank's sentence be commuted to life imprisonment. In a single day, Frank received over 1,500 letters himself. In Georgia itself, some 10,000 residents were courageous enough, and this did take courage in Georgia at this time, signed a petition on behalf of Leo Frank. If one is to find a heroic figure in this tragedy, it was the governor of Georgia, John M. Slayton. In the long line of appeals, both for retrial and for commutation of death, he was the final person to consider the case before the sentence was carried out. Slayton's meticulous examination of the trial record and the new evidence led to grave doubts about the truthfulness of Conley's testimony. One example of such evidence, the Annie Maud Carter affidavit of Jim Conley's confession to her that he murdered Mary Fagan, and the letters to her from Jim Conley, which maintain the same wording, phrases, and language as the murder notes. All of this made him think that Jim Conley, and not Leo Frank, was the murderer of Mary Fagan. Slayton wrote about these examples and many others in his commutation order. He also took into account the letter from Judge Rowan describing the death sentence as a mistake and requesting that that mistake be rectified. At this stage, for Slayton to commute Frank's sentence to life imprisonment made him vulnerable to charges of being bought by the Jews. He received over 1,000 letters threatening to kill him and his wife if he let Frank live. He nonetheless persisted, stating, "This case has been marked by doubt. The trial judge doubted. 2 judges of the Supreme Court of Georgia doubted. And 2 judges of the Supreme Court of the United States doubted. I can endure misconstruction, abuse, and condemnation, but I cannot stand the constant companionship of an accusing conscience." Governor Slayton commutes Leo Frank's sentence to life imprisonment, and Leo Frank is unobtrusively transferred to the state prison in Milledgeville. As predicted, the commutation order set off a storm of indignation and inflamed many citizens of Georgia. Tom Watson urged violence, even lynching, as the only remaining way for people to find justice, since Slayton had sold out to the Jews. After the commutation order, Governor Slayton became the most unpopular, reviled politician in Georgia history. An angry mob marched to the governor's mansion, armed with an array of weapons, including dynamite and chanting, "Slayton, King of the Jews. Slayton, King of the Jews." State troopers in the mansion were finally able to disperse the mob, and Governor Slayton's promising political career was ruined by his courageous commutation of Leo Frank's sentence. He was never again elected to office. On July 17th, at Midgeville, where Frank was incarcerated, William Crean, a twice convicted murderer, crept up on Frank while he was asleep and cut his throat. Only the speedy attention of 3 nearby doctors saved Frank's life. 5 days after the stabbing, Tom Watson cruelly wrote, "Note, the butcher knife used had been in operation during the day, killing hogs, kosher." Other ominous efforts were underfoot to harm Leo Frank. A group calling itself the Knights of Mary Fagan has sworn over her grave to avenge her murder. The Knights were not a lynch mob in the sense normally understood. They were headed by what must be termed respectable citizens. Among their number was a former judge, a former sheriff, a clergyman, and highly respected lawyers and legislators. Their argument was legalistic. They had long waited for the legal system to work, but it had not. They were carrying out what that system had failed to do. The Knights planned the attack on Midgeville Prison Farm. Steve Oney writes that several prestigious members of the Knights had visited the state prison's warden a few days earlier to ensure that the lynch party would have safe passage. August 16, 1915, the 25-man lynch party in 7 cars arrives at the prison at 9 p.m. It took the armed men only 10 minutes to break into the grounds, seize Frank, who was lying in bed in his nightshirt, and return to their cars. They headed for Marietta, Mary Fagan's hometown, where she was buried. Using back roads, it took them all night. The cavalcade arrives at 6 a.m. at Frey's Gin, a wooded piece of land 2 miles east of Marietta. The land is owned by one of the lynchers, William Frey, the former local sheriff. Leo Frank utters his last words, "I think more of my wife and my mother than I do of my own life." And he was then hanged. By 7:30 a.m., an excited crowd of 1,000 men, women, and children gathered to gawk and cheer at Frank's body hanging from the tree. Snapshots were reproduced in great number and became a popular item in Georgia, sold throughout the state for many years. Horror over the lynching was expressed throughout the United States, even by most of the authorities in Georgia. However, the grand jury that investigated the lynching reported it could find no evidence and obtain no testimony against the Knights of Mary Fagan, in spite of widespread knowledge of who they were. I mean, their names are listed in Steve Oney's book. In 1982, Alonzo Mann, 83 years old and in very poor health, prepared an affidavit for a newspaper in which he stated he knew for certain that Leo Frank was innocent and Jim Conley was guilty. Mann worked as Leo Frank's office boy. He was 13 years old also at the time of the murder. Shortly after noon that day, Mann entered the building through the main entrance on the first floor and saw a surprised Jim Conley near the trapdoor hole carrying the limp body of Mary Fagan. And after Conley threatened to kill him, Mann ran outside, did not tell anyone what he had seen except for his parents, who insisted that he remain silent. After making the affidavit, Mann passed a lie detector test. In March of 1986, the Georgia Board of Pardons finally pardoned Leo Frank. However, the pardon studiously avoided declaring Frank innocent. Rather, it recognized the failure of the state to protect the person of Frank and thereby preserve his opportunity for legal appeal of his conviction. The pardon further stated, "It is impossible to decide conclusively the guilt or innocence of Leo Frank." After all of that, Leo Frank was buried in Mount Carmel Cemetery in Queens, New York. The site of his lynching, once in the midst of a grove of trees, is now a modern brown brick building surrounded by discount stores and fast food franchises. Affixed to the wall of the building is a metal plaque placed there by Rabbi Stephen Lebo in 1995 on the 80th anniversary of Leo Frank's pitiless lynching. The plaque reads, "Wrongly accused, falsely convicted, wantonly murdered." It is painful to hear and to tell this story. But we thank you so much for your respectful attention and for bearing witness with us of this shameful injustice.